Hi, I'm Mike Kelly from Project Healing Waters Omaha, and we have a special visitor from Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. Daryl Bauer is a fisheries biologist and acts as the fisheries outreach manager. Daryl's living proof that the more you learn about fish behavior, the more success you'll have. He holds 120 Master Angler Awards for 14 species. I don't know if that's been updated since then, and more than 30 in-fisherman Master Angler Awards. So if you want to know about anything about fishing in Nebraska, he's the person to ask. He loves to talk about fishing in Nebraska, and he's here tonight to share some information with us from an article he recently published in Nebraska Land Magazine on crappie. And if you want to get into other fish species like we talked about right before we started, he'll be glad to talk about it. So with that, Daryl, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Mike, and thank you guys for having me. It's an honor to be here with you tonight. And yeah, I can talk crappie. We can talk. I can talk crappie for a long time, but it's a topic that comes around every year about this time. And I joke that it's springtime and everyone thinks they're fishermen. And a big reason for that is there can be some easy fishing in the spring. And I think what a lot of people think of is hitting the banks and catching some crappies in the spring. And we're right in the middle of that right now in Nebraska. Of course, today we've had a big weather shift and a big west wind blow all day. So I'm sure that's going to slow the bite a little bit. But last few days, last couple of weeks, I've been seeing a lot of reports of people doing very well on crappies on a variety of waters, small waters, big waters, from one end of the state to the other. So it's certainly that time of year. I don't know. Yeah, I've talked about it, blogged about it many times, given presentations on it. Crappies are a very popular fish. They're panfish. They're relatively easy to catch, especially in the spring. And I think that's one reason they're very popular. And of course, if you want to keep a few fish for a meal, they're very good on the table too. So a lot of people think of grabbing the family, the kids, everyone, and getting out. And certainly this is a time of year they can do that and have some good success catching crappies. We actually see crappies start moving shallow. It's not just the spawn, and people think, well, they're moving shallow for the spawn. And that certainly is true right now. They're getting close to the spawn. And you can see that in some of the fish are being caught. I've seen pictures of, I caught a few crappies last week, and they definitely get a darker color. They color up for the spawn, especially the males. That includes white crappies and black crappies. There are two species of crappies. We have both of them in the state. In fact, in many waters, both species are found in the same body of water. But even the white crappies, come spawn time, will be relatively dark and really can be confused for black crappies, but they just may be male white crappies in spawning colors. Anyhow, the spawn is certainly right now getting close or even on in a lot of our waters, but crappies start moving shallow early spring. In fact, right after the ice goes out, you'll see some crappie movement shallow. It's all dependent, though, on weather conditions and warming water. Crappies love moving into shallow water in early spring where they can start to warm up and start feeding. They love those protected areas. Bays and coves are good crappie habitat, especially in the spring, year round, but especially in the spring. Bays and coves and protected areas are key crappie habitat. So we get some warm weather as soon as the ice goes out. If we get a few days of warm weather, you'll see crappies pull up into those shallow protected areas, and you can start catching them right away. And in fact, it's weeks until they spawn when they make those early spring movements. Now, in a lot of our waters, some of the habitats that they'll spawn in are the same areas, those protected shallow areas, especially if there's some woody cover there or maybe some last year's aquatic vegetation growth or maybe some rocks, some kind of shallow cover is prime crappie spawning habitat. So you'll see them move into those shallow areas right away in the spring, right after the ice goes out. But in our waters, a lot of our waters, they'll stay in some of those same areas for weeks then. And now, as we're moving into the spawn period, they'll be in some of the same areas, but the males will start making nests and garden nests and trying to herd a female in to spawn on the nest with them. And then they'll stay on those nests for some time after the eggs are laid and the fry hatch. They'll still be in some of those same shallow protected areas and bays and coves that they were in right after the ice went out. So that's another reason I think crappies are really popular is they move shallow in the spring. So they're accessible to a lot of anglers, including a lot of beginning anglers. And then they stay shallow for a long period of time. So you can get in on some good crappie fishing for weeks long in the spring. And then as the spawn finishes up, some of them will stay shallow throughout the summer, but a lot of them will tend to start to move out into deeper water. And a lot of our Nebraska waters, they'll roam open water during the summer, following bait fish or bug hatches out in some of that open water. During the summer, where they're still catchable, that they're just not as shallow, they're not as easy to find and as easy to catch. So springtime's a prime time and a popular time where a lot of people are hitting the banks and catching some crappies right now. The bite will slow a little bit during the actual spawn. I mentioned crappies are nest builders. The males build a nest or fan out a shallow depression, usually next to some type of cover, and then the males guard those nests. There's some territoriality that goes on. The males will spar with each other to protect their nest. And then any female that shows up ready to spawn, the males will try and coax her onto their nest and spawn with her. So when they actually start spawning, those males especially become a lot more, what do I want to say, tied down to that spawning nest, that spawning territory. So they're not moving around. They're not looking for food. They're concentrating on guarding that nest and guarding their territory. And I always joke during the spawn that those fish have other things on their mind rather than feeding. But you can still catch them even during the spawn if you put a bait or a lure or some kind on that nest right in that spawning territory. And usually the key there during that period is to keep it there. If you move too fast, you'll pull it off that spawning territory out of that bed. And then, the males just sit there. They stay on the nest and your bait is pulled away from them. The females you can still catch. They'll usually be adjacent to the spawning beds, maybe a little bit deeper water. But again, as they get towards the actual spawn, they're interested in, finding a bed and depositing eggs, and they're a lot less interested in taking food. That'll last during their spawn, and then as soon as they're done, they'll start looking for food and feeding again. So as we get into the actual spawn on a lot of Nebraska waters, which is going to be happening right now, they can still be caught. You just may not need to slow down, fish a little tighter to cover, and give those fish a chance to bite, and then expect the fishing to pick up again when they start feeding after the spawn. But then they'll start to disperse out into a more open water where they'll spend the summer. So that's kind of a nutshell of crappie behavior during this springtime, and why they're so popular amongst anglers. I think another thing that makes crappies real popular is they're fairly relatively easy to catch. I always tell folks it's hard to beat a small minnow on a light wire hook in a bobber. If live bait fish are legal, and we have some waters where there's restrictions on using live bait fish, But if you can use a live minnow, a small minnow below a bobber, pretty much works for crappies most all the time. And I've always joked, I don't care how old you are, most of us started catching fish when we were kids by watching a bobber go under. And you know what? It's still pretty fun to watch a bobber go under all these years later, too. So that's always a good presentation for crappies. But then they take a variety of other baits too, small jigs, and of course they can readily be caught on fly fishing gear, because you guys know you can present a variety of small well, wet fly streamers, nymph patterns. Crappies feed primarily on aquatic insects and then small fish. So any of your patterns that imitate something buggy, or something that looks like a small fish, will generally work for crappies. So the small, I call them micro jigs or weighted nymphs or streamers, will generally work for crappies. And a lot of times they'll work just as well as live bait will. So I think the key is, and I love watching crappies in an aquarium, because you'll get to see how their feeding strategy. And if you notice crappies in aquarium, they're just pretty laid back. If you throw some minnows in an aquarium, bass or hybrid striped bass or white bass or something like that, you literally just be chasing minnows and running them around in the aquarium trying to catch them. The crappies are much more laid back and much more casual. They just kind of like to just, hover around and not act like a predator. But the whole time they've got their eyes on those bait fish too, and they're just trying to ease into position. And then when they get that bait in a position where they know they can grab it without it getting away from them, you got to watch close because they'll open up and suck that bait in and it'll be gone. So knowing that, I think tells you a key thing about presentations for crappie is generally you want to be relatively slow and relatively you don't need to put a lot of action in the bait, just slow and easy, just a steady retrieve. You don't necessarily need to do a lot of jigging and hopping and things like that. Just put it in the zone and move it slowly, or even let it pause and maybe settle a little bit, or just hang in front of them. And that's usually what you need to do to catch crappies. So keep those things in mind. And they're popular fish found in a lot of waters across Nebraska. And right now is the time to get out and get after them.
Excellent. Um, Daryl, if you're fishing over a spawning area and catching a few crappie, catch and release, you release a few males. Do those males go back to their nest, or do they fight for a different nest, or do they get disoriented and just go somewhere else, or what normally is the behavior if you're catching and
Yeah,
releasing them?
sure. Generally, they'll go right back to the nest. I mean, if they get, if they're abused, not properly handled, to where they're stressed or hurt, then they're probably going to go someplace else. But if they're released quickly in good condition, generally they'll turn right around, go right back onto that nest, the same nest that they were guarding. They'll be right back on there as soon as they can. And in fact, sometimes you leave them alone because you can keep catching that same fish over and over again. If you keep putting a bait on its bed, on that same spawning bed, you can catch that same male over and over again. So if you're going to release them, probably after you've exercised them a time or two, it's probably good to move on and target another fish, or maybe down the shoreline where there's some other crappie beds.
I have one more that I think it'd be interesting, and then we can kind of open it for other people to ask
Sure.
questions if they want to. Um, I know the thinking kind of changes over the years on selective harvest, catch and release. Um, I think with crappie and bluegill in Nebraska, it's probably not as critical for catch and release because they're so prolific. Um, but can you give a little bit of your current feelings on selective harvest
Sure.
and
Yeah, and I believe me, I'll crawl up on that soapbox every chance I get. I'm a huge fan of selective harvest. Now, that means a lot of my fish are caught and released. But selective harvest is a philosophy where you know what, fish are darn good to eat, especially fresh fish. And I just mentioned that's one reason crappies are so popular is they're mighty tasty. The selective harvest would tell you that it's okay to take some fish for a meal, fresh fish. But then when you choose to do that, try to select the species and sizes of fish that are most abundant and can withstand some harvest. And that certainly includes panfish species, bluegills you mentioned, or crappies that we've been talking about. So certainly they are the species, or black and white crappies both. You talk about both species that can withstand some harvest. So in most of our waters, you don't need to feel guilty about taking a few crappies home for a meal. In fact, there's some waters where we have waters in Nebraska where our crappies are so prolific, their spawning success is so high that you can take a lot of crappies and you're not going to hurt anything. In fact, you may do some good by harvesting some of those fish from the population. When I say that, though, I will mention this. I always put an asterisk. Um, Big fish are special, and that's big fish of any species. And that includes big panfish. It's a special crappie that grows to be large. And those fish are rare fish. That's why they're so hard to catch. It's not because they're so smart, it's because they're not abundant. They're rare. So even if you're taking some crappies for a meal of fresh fish, I'd tell you, all the 9, 10 inchers, maybe a little bit bigger than that, that you want to keep, you're not going to hurt a thing. But believe me, if I catch any really big crappies, those fish are getting up over 13, 14 inches, maybe even bigger than that. I still believe those are good candidates for release because they can be recycled. Those big trophy fish could be caught again, maybe by somebody else. Hopefully, I get to catch them again. And then there's a lot of research that indicates that some those bigger fish may be some of your best genetic stock in that population. So you need to get big fish, you need fast growing fish, especially panfish. So to get big crappies, you need fast growing crappies. And if you have a big crappie, chances are that's one of the faster growers in a population. And therefore, I'd tell you, still a good candidate for release. So selective harvest, I think, is the way to go. And certainly you can selectively harvest some crappies, some panfish, but even then, think about turning those big ones loose.
anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, Daryl, John, right here. Just a second. There you go.
Hey, John.
Hey, uh, how's Ogallala? I haven't been out there since we did the renovation on it, and
Yep.
I know you told me the last time that there were some great fish down in the off the weirs.
Yep.
Is that still the case? And how is the big lake, the Lake Ogallala itself doing? That I understand the trout should be magnificent in there by now.
Yeah, our trout fishery's back. John referred to, we did a chemical renovation out there. It'd be a year ago last fall. And that's been done periodically in Lake Ogallala, that we have a tailwater fishery there that we can support trout. In fact, fast growing and some big trophy rainbow trout. The problem is there's carp and suckers in there too, and over time, carp and sucker numbers tend to increase and eventually get to the point where they're out competing the trout for food resources. And then the other thing that happens is you get enough of them in there, then water quality starts to deteriorate and aquatic vegetation starts to decline. And that's where all those bugs are at, all those aquatic insects, which is the reason the trout grow phenomenally fast in there. So periodically, we've done renovations on Lake Ogallala over the years, and the last time was just about a year and a half ago. The good news is once we do that, the trout that are stocked back in there grow like weeds, and we've got rainbows back in the lake and in the river, And with water in the canal, there'll be some fish down in the canal too. Some of those trout will be over, and by last fall already, there were 20-inch trout in that system. So they're still growing, and there'll be some getting to be up around, I would guess, by this next fall, we'll start seeing some maybe 23, 24 inchers in that system, which is a really nice rainbow trout. The other thing is we stock rainbows, and this last year we started putting some cut bows in there too, just for a little variety. And those are frequently stocked in the spring and the fall. So it's not just a few big fish that were stocked right after the renovation. There's been other stockings since then. So the density of fish is really good. And then the potential for big fish is there too. Some yellow perch are back in there. And then, of course, anything that comes down from Lake McConaughey, you'll find a few of them in there too. And yes, there will be carp and suckers back in there again. And I know that's been a popular fishery for some big carp. And give them some time. There's some back in there already. And over time, there will be some more. So Lake Ogallala is looking really good. I can tell you right now, any chance I get to fish Lake Ogallala, I'm going to be taking it.
You need a boat to get out there, Daryl?
You know, a boat helps, sure. You know, I'd always tell you that, but I'll also tell you I fish out of a pair of waders almost all the time. And the thing I like about that system is between Lake Ogallala itself, the stretch of the North Platte River below Lake Ogallala, and then the canal for several miles downstream from Lake Ogallala. Just about any time of year, you can find some place there where you can catch fish, even if you don't have a boat. So my strategy there is if I'm not catching fish on the lake, I'm going to go try the canal or try the river, or vice versa. I'll keep moving until there's trout there's someplace. Usually the challenge is to figure out which bug they're eating and matching that, and you get that figured out, then you can usually have a really good day.
That kind of leads into what we're going to talk about later. But do
Yeah.
you know offhand? I know you're not an entomologist, but being a fisheries biologist, you kind of dabble, I'm sure.
Oh yeah,
You know
oh yeah,
what the main insect species in
sure.
Ogallala area that they mostly feed off of?
Yep, I can answer that easy. It's midge larvae, chironomids. That's the main one. But believe me, there's a good variety, diversity of aquatic insects in that system. So at times I've seen when caddis they were feeding on caddis larvae or pupae. There's even been times where they're chasing damselfly larvae. There's a variety there. And you know what? If there's some alewives, bait fish coming through the dam from Lake McConaughey, those big rainbows especially will be whacking those alewives too. So when I'm on that system, I almost always know there's fish there. I'm on fish. They're right there. There's just a challenge of figuring out what pattern or what bait or lure you got to use to get them to bite. And some days it'll take me all day to figure that out. Some days I never figure it out, but other days you get it figured out really quick and you can really catch a lot of fish and some really nice fish then.
Hey,
Mike,
Carl, a few years ago, there was a move afoot from the folks out in the Scotts Bluff area to reseed Lake McConaughey with the McConaughey rainbow. Remember that? And I think they were starting the whole thing in 9 Mile Creek. Whatever happened to that? Do you know?
The, I can answer a little bit
Yeah.
of that. As far as I know, there's some of their efforts still are continuing. They're they're placing eggs in incubators in those streams,
Yeah.
letting them hatch. So they are adding some fish to those streams. Um, our the biggest bottleneck with that now is we just don't have trout water in Lake McConaughey anymore. So what used to happen is those fish would migrate down into Lake McConaughey, and then we had trout water in McConaughey back when it was a younger reservoir, and they could, again, feed on bait fish for a few years and get really big and fat, and then they'd migrate back up into those streams to spawn. So I think you're going to see mostly resident trout in the streams now, but they are still doing some of those eggs and adding some rainbows to those panhandle streams.
Thank you.
And this is Emil Baritek. Back in 2011, 2012, I fished a lot of Ogallala in the North Platte, and just prince nymphs, pheasant tails, and woolly boogers were working.
Yep.
And back then, that was, as I say, the last time I did any fishing. It was spectacular. So if now is anything like that, it also always depends on how much water they're putting into the river.
Right. And that is very key. And I'm always checking what the flows are. That's going to depend on how much water comes down from the mountains this year, how dry it remains, how much they release for irrigation, how much they can hold in McConaughey. So I can't make any predictions on that. The irrigation power district has all the control of the water, and all you can do is try and see what they're releasing and then try and hit it when it looks good.
Right.
What number do you use, Daryl, for the river?
What's that?
How many CFS do you consider a good time to fish the river?
Well, I've fished it everywhere from like 20 CFS up to over 3,000. And believe me, when it's up 3,000, all you can do is fish the edges.
Yeah, I was going to say it's coming over the weir.
Yeah, I think if you get it up 500, maybe up to as much as 1,000, I think that's, in my opinion, that's where it's really good. Although I will tell you, you have to be careful where you're wading and what you're doing, especially as you get up towards 1,000. That's why I say a few hundred CFS, you can usually wade just about everywhere you want to go. And that's a pretty good flow that gives the fish a lot of area and a lot of good current seams for them to sit in. So I think that's when it's really good. But I've caught fish there from a trickle all the way up to when it was roaring, when we had some high water conditions.
Yeah, if the water is more than 6 inches going over that weir, it's tough to walk.
Yeah, you got to be careful. Yeah.
Daryl?
Yeah.
Can I get back to a crappie question here?
Oh, I'd love it. You bet.
Okay, is there a specific water temperature or moon phase or anything that actually entices these fish to do what they want to do?
Yeah. I'll give you a long biologist answer for that. There's a variety of cues that'll cue spawning in freshwater fish, in Nebraska freshwater fish. That can include water temperature. It could include water flows. It could include things like, moon phase and things like that. I think for most of our species, and that includes crappies, photo period or the amount of daylight is one of the main cues that triggers spawning. So when I say that, you can generally plan that spawning is going to happen about the same time every year. There'll be some modification depending on the weather, of course, that may modify that a week or two either direction. And then in Nebraska, we're a big state with a lot of variety in weather and climate from one end to the other. So you'll see the crappie spawn is, a couple weeks, maybe even a month earlier in southeast corner of the state compared to clear out in the northwest corner or clear out in the northern sandhills. So, but it's mostly photo period, I believe, that triggers that spawn with some effects from the weather from year to year.
What about water temperature?
I'm not a big believer in magic water temperatures. So I'd hate to quote you a water temperature for when they're going to be spawning, because it'll happen about the same time every year, and it'll happen within a range of temperatures. Now, I will tell you this, it is in the springtime, and if you get a late spring cold snap, that'll definitely knock them back. In fact, if it gets really cold, they may pull off the beds for a while. So I'm generally looking for trends in water temperature more than I am any one particular temperature. Is the water temperature staying steady or rising, or have you had, a cold front go through, maybe even a late spring snowstorm and knock that temperature back? And that's usually what I'm looking for when I'm looking at, and believe me, I take water temperatures every time I'm out, but I'm looking for trends more than I am any magic temperature.
Okay.
Walt, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Daryl, I'm in Missouri, so I don't know how big a difference it is. And I have about an acre and a half old quarry.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Is there any particular vegetation that would help crappie?
Is there any vegetation in the quarry now?
There was a lot of spatter duck,
Okay.
but I killed it. I
Okay.
killed all my fish.
All right.
So I'm reintroducing stuff in now.
Um, Here's the way I answer that. There's lots of different species of aquatic vegetation. There are invasive species of aquatic vegetation, some of which cause problems. But I'll
Spatter
tell you,
duck.
just about all of it provides good habitat for fish. Any kind of aquatic vegetation, I would tell you I'd rather have vegetation than no vegetation. And that's true for crappies too. I think for crappies, especially if you're looking for spawning habitat, some kind of emergent vegetation. And by emergent, I'm talking about things like cattails, bulrushes. Those are usually the types of cover, the types of vegetation the crappies will spawn in. But if you had some spatterdock or some lilies or lotus of some kind, they'll spawn in and around those stalks too. And even, submerged vegetation, if there's some of that, maybe comes on and starts growing early, they'll use that, or some of the old stuff that's left over from last year. They'll even use that in the spring as cover and maybe even as spawning habitat. Usually, I would tell you if you're interested in getting some vegetation started, and I don't care if that's in Missouri or Nebraska or anywhere, if you can find some vegetation in other waters near yours and do some transplanting, that's usually the best way to get some of the local stock that's going to do well in your water. So I'd caution you to make sure you aren't moving some type of invasive species around. But other than that, if you can find some vegetation to transplant, that'd be a good way to get it started.
What about Christmas cedar trees?
Yep. We do a lot of work with cedar trees, and they provide great fish attractors for crappies. Crappies love them. And the reason we use a lot of cedar trees is they're readily available, and most of the time our land managers are trying to get rid of them. So they'll be cutting cedar trees, and we can put them in, and they make good fish attractors. And the crappies absolutely love that woody cover. So if you have access to any kind of trees like that, cedar trees or whatever, any of that added to the shallow water, I can just about guarantee you there'll be crappies using it.
One caution I would give you on cedar
what depth
trees.
of water?
Well, in a quarry, I would caution you about going too deep because you may have water deep enough in a quarry, or in Nebraska, we have sand pits, and some of those have water that's deep enough that during the summer that water stratifies, and you actually will have no fish in that deep water during the summer because it's stratified and there's no oxygen down there. So just a general rule of thumb, I'd keep it like, 6, 8, maybe 10 feet and shallower, because then that should be shallow enough that the fish can use that to cover spring, fall, winter, summer, year round.
Okay, the quarry is probably about the deepest spot is 15 feet,
Okay.
and it goes down to about 9 feet, right, Larry?
Yeah, somewhere around there.
And then
Usually
a
on the rocks and against the bluff.
lot of rocks, but and I put a bubbler system inside
Okay. Yeah.
to put oxygen in the water.
Right. You may not have to worry about stratification then. And then in that case, I'd tell you if you want to put some in some deep water, you could too, which they'll probably be more likely to use that in the spring, or not the spring, the summer and the winter. A key on that's to scatter it out, put it at a variety of depths.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
You
Come
bet.
down to Missouri, I'll let you fish in the place.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
I thought you saved that for me, Walt. That's my spot.
All right. Is there any more questions before we get on to matching hatches and hatch charts and all that stuff?
I guess I just have one question on growth rate. How long does it take a crappie typically to get to 15 inches if he gets there?
I could turn around behind me and pull a book off of my desk that's about that thick that has growth rates, just growth rate data on variety of species and waters all through Nebraska. So I could quote you growth rates until you got tired of the numbers. But if you're talking about a 15-inch crappie, that's a big crappie and it's going to take several years. You're probably looking at a fish, even with fast growth, exceptionally fast growth, to get a crappie that big, you're probably looking at a fish that's 8, 10 years old at least, and more likely quite a few years older than that. Now,
What's
I
the
always go
what's the
ahead.
lifespan on a crappie?
Um, it all depends. There's a lot of variability in both growth rates and lifespan, but generally speaking, especially compared to some other fish, crappie are a relatively short-lived species of fish. So well, in some cases, you may only see them live 4 or 6 years. And you may not, again, in other cases, you may see them live up to 8, 10 years old, but you start getting any older than that, that's pretty rare for crappie.
Thank you.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, Roger here. Once they leave the spawning beds and stuff, and said they tend to go out into the larger body, do they stay within close to the surface? They're going to be off the bottom. I mean, it's going to vary with where you are, but if you go someplace, where do you tackle it when you know they're kind of out there a little bit?
Yeah, and it's going to vary a lot depending on what they're feeding on, what prey they're primarily feeding on. So, yeah, I hate to give you, again, one of my favorite answers is it depends. In a lot of our Nebraska, especially our reservoirs, they'll be out in open water and they're following open water bait fish. So they may not be on the surface, but they're certainly not on the bottom of the lake either. They're literally just out roaming in open water. Maybe, it depends on where those bait fish are at. Maybe 6, 8 feet down, maybe a little deeper. On the other hand, and like pits, quarries, smaller ponds, smaller reservoirs, that aquatic insects may be more important as a prey source, and then they're going to be more likely to be near the bottom or near a submerged aquatic vegetation, and they may be a lot deeper then. So, yeah, that doesn't really give you a good answer. It just depends. Crappies like to suspend a lot. I will tell you that. So, I'm not going to say you don't always have to be fishing near the bottom to catch crappies, and it's not unusual. You may be catching them 6, 8 feet down over 20, 30 feet of water. So look for them to be suspended. That's a classic crappie behavior.
Hey,
Mhm.
All right. Well, we'll get started on the other topic tonight.
I'll hang out for a while too, Mike. I want to hear you.
Okay. No problem.
You bet.
But feel free to step in if I say something wrong, because you're the biologist and I'm just kind of explaining what I do. So basically, if you get an opportunity to travel to trout country, example, you're going to go, say, to Estes Park and with the family, and there's going to be an opportunity for you to fish for a day or two. You first of all, you can search the internet for like fishing reports or stocking data. Call some fly shops, look on social media or some fishing apps. But that's basically how you determine what kind of fish are in a certain lake. And to be honest with you, a lot of times I'll just get on Google and say, what kind of fish are in Dream Lake in Estes Park? And it'll say, mostly cutthroat and, different rivers, different streams, what kind of fish are in this stream. And a lot of times you'll get an answer, whether it's, now they have the little AI tie-ins to Google and everything, but it'll go out and search whatever's on the internet. And a lot of times it's data from fly shops that give you that. And really, I like to pack light and efficient most of the time. So for me, I don't like to bring, especially if I'm traveling with on a family vacation, I don't want to bring a whole bunch of gear and to be sorting through and everything. If I need to decide on what to use. So I'm going to start off with the basics of trout forage that you learned in first grade biology, and just kind of breeze through this real quick. Just to kind of set a frame of reference. So the main insects that trout feed on, especially out west, you're going to find mayflies, caddisflies, stoneflies are along the top, midges on the bottom row, and then dragonflies and damselflies, and then of course terrestrials. But you also have to kind of focus on adult versus the nymph or the larval stage, depending on the species. So there's like a mayfly and a mayfly nymph, caddisfly, and their young are larvae. So depending on the species, some of them will build a case like a cocoon, whether it's gravel or sticks or leaves or just web. And some of them are kind of free living. With midges, the young is larva as well, and they normally look kind of like, they can be different colors, red, olive, but there's a stage in between here in the adult, the pupal stage, same with the caddis, where it's probably, I probably should have put that on here because that's probably one of the most vulnerable stages of those insects' lives, because the larvae are more likely to be hidden under rocks, down in the detritus. Same with the midge larva, but it's the pupa as they start to rise toward the surface to hatch. That's when they're the most vulnerable. Excuse me. And then for stoneflies, there's an example of a stonefly nymph. Damselflies, as Daryl was talking, we have a lot of damselflies in Nebraska. Trout and other species of fish. Damselflies are big food for crappie, bluegill, all kinds of fish in Nebraska. And dragonfly nymphs, they're big and ugly. And speaking of ugly, this is a cranefly larva. Reportedly, the woolly bugger was supposed to have been designed to be a imitation of a cranefly larva. But that kind of sets the stage for, what the insects look like. And then we have a lot of different flies that represent the adult and the nymph forms. Again, a mayfly parachute is a pretty common, whether it's a parachute Adams or this is an olive colored one. And then the nymph, a caddis adult, and this is a caddis pupa. A stonefly and a stonefly imitation. This is a Pat's rubber legs is a good stonefly nymph imitation. Then you get into terrestrials and ants, hoppers, woolly buggers, and little streamers. There's flies that are just general attractors. There's no insects that have red and green bodies, or a bright red belly. But some of these flies are for decades have been some of the most productive flies that there are just as attractors. With midges, you don't necessarily always want to be tying size 26 flies, but you can tie a cluster fly like this that imitates a cluster of adults. And instead of picking off individual size 26 midges, they're going to be going after the clusters of adults. And then there's midge pupa imitations, and then of course San Juan worm. But one of the first things I do when I'm planning to go on a trip somewhere is I'll look. A lot of times you can find them on websites for fly shops. Is look for a hatch chart, and this is a real basic example of what you usually find in these hatch charts. So basically, it's what to expect throughout the year for any given fishery. And you can have different charts for still water and streams. If you're in Colorado, it could be different for the Gunnison or the Colorado. It could be different on the upper Colorado than it is, on a bigger, wider river. But once you're looking at a hatch chart like this, it's basically tells you what flies that you need to have to pick from, basically to be prepared. It maybe if you're not tying your own flies, you want to stop at a fly shop. It'll tell you what flies to actually ask for, and they'll probably help you in most fly shops. But it'll also kind of give you an idea of what gear to bring. If you're mostly using small midges and small flies, if you're early in the year, you might be able to bring a little bit lighter tackle than if you're going to be using great big huge flies, like say salmon flies, stone flies that are larger and more wind resistant. You're going to need a little bit more, like, as opposed to like a 3 or a 4 weight line, you're going to need maybe a 6 weight line to take those wind resistant flies and get them to go out there. So we'll start with this black midge. A lot of the names on these hatch charts are pretty self-explanatory. Black midge, size 18 to 24, you just need to tie or buy a black or a dark colored midge that's in that size range. And normally, although fly shops would probably want you to or recommend it, you don't really need to get a 18, a 20, a 22, and a 24 to be prepared. You could have, say, an 18 and a 22. Or if you want to try them, you could have, say, an 18 and a 24. You don't really need all the sizes in between. That just gives you the basic size range of what they find in January, February, and the first part of March. But when you get to some of these other things, Papnia, I don't really know what that is. I can look on their chart and I can see that it's a stonefly, but I don't know what color it is. I don't really know what it looks like. It does help to know that it's size 16 to 18. So again, you can, taking that hatch chart, you can go to the internet and say, what is a Capnia stonefly? Well, a Google search actually gave me a picture of what the nymphs look like, what the adults look like. It's a little black stonefly. And that's kind of a common name. It would have been better if they put that on the chart than Capnia. If they put little black stonefly, that would tell you size 16 to 18 dark colored stonefly. And then if you click on some of these other things, you can actually read some more information on them. But the Mother's Day caddis, it doesn't tell you what color it is. All it really tells you, the reason it's called a Mother's Day caddis is the the time of year that they normally hatch. But if you look it up, I found that it's a tan or an olive caddis fly in size 12 to 16. Here's an example from Dakota Angler in Rapid City. A little bit different looking hatch chart, and they give some more information. Like, say, the example of the black caddis, they hatch in late March through June. And then they give you some examples of what flies to ask for or to tie. They also kind of give some descriptions of what they look like. So for the larval stage, tanner green larvae, and some different flies to tie. They give a couple of like scientific names, but for the most part, different hatch charts are going to give you more or less information. And a lot of times, if it comes from a fly shop and not like, say, an organization, a group, or a club, you'll probably have a lot of flies that you can buy in their shop that they recommend. But they'll also just give some common ones that you can pretty much buy anywhere. So back to this other hatch chart. If I was going to go, I think this is the Madison, is where this was. Definitely out west, because you've got salmon flies and green drakes and a lot of stone flies. But if I was going, say, in first part of July on my birthday, I'm going to have to actually be prepared for mother caddis. Again, I looked it up. It was olive or tan caddis, sizes 12 to 16. Salmon fly is a big stone fly, size 4 to 8, which is huge. Have some green drakes, which is again just a mayfly, and then ants or beetles. And now, part of what I wanted to focus on is you don't really have to be an entomologist. You don't have to know the scientific names and know one from another. The Adams dry fly is one of the most popular and one of the most fish catching flies that there are out there. And it's not because there are mayflies out there that have a gray body, brown and grizzly legs and tail. It's just that it's a good generic silhouette. It's got the profile. It's got the silhouette of a mayfly, and you can use different flies that you buy in fly shops or that you tie. You can tie some dark ones, some light ones, and you don't really need to identify the actual species. I had a little, I didn't embed the video, but it's about a 10-minute video on how to read different rise forms. And so let me back up a little bit. So we looked at the hatch charts, and we found that these are the flies that I need to have available in my fly box, buy some or tie some. And then once I actually get to the water, how do I know which ones of those to actually use? So probably the first thing that you can do is actually look at just when you get to the water, just kind of look around, look for maybe swallows flying around. That'll give an indication of some insects in the air. If you can see the surface of the water, you can look for adult insects or emergers, like the top two pictures there. The first two pictures is a mayfly and a midge that are emerging from their nymphal shuck. and very vulnerable at that time. They make a big profile on the surface of the water. They might cause a little bit of vibration as they're trying to wriggle free. And fish will key on emergers because they know it's an easy catch. If that fly is getting ready to fly off the water, then they're likely to miss it, and they're not going to waste their time. If they see something that's struggling, they're going to go after that. So look at the surface of the water. Then you might have to make sure that the fish are actually well, we'll get into that in a minute. This some other examples of how to tell what's in the water. This first guy's got a little net, and you can either kick around the rocks a little bit and dislodge some insects that might be clinging to the rocks, or just hold that net down into the water and then pick it up and see what you can find in the net that's in the water column. There might be emerging insects that'll show up in your net, and you know that that's the kind of thing that's in the water. That's probably what the trout are feeding on. You can look at spider webs around the bushes and the weeds and stuff around the edges of the water, and look for some fresh insects that are in that spider web. And then maybe, these are kind of a brownish color body. Just look for something in your fly box that comes close to that. If nothing else, tie on an Adams or something that's a mayfly imitation. At least that tells you that there's mayflies in the area. And then it's pretty common to tell people to turn over rocks, but I'm not really that sold on that as a as help when you're fishing, because if you turn over a rock, you might find a few different species of nymphs and some caddis, some cased caddis larvae and stuff like that. But you have to remember that those are under rocks. They're not floating around in the water column. Fish aren't so likely to be able to find those. Fish aren't going to turn over rocks and eat them. It's more important what's on the surface and what's floating in the water column than what's under the rocks. If you want to know what species of insects are in that area, that'll tell you that, if you can identify the little critters. But it's not so much an indication of what you should be fishing with, actually. So again, we go back to the things that you found on the surface and the things you found, floating in the water column. Just go through your fly box and pick out what looks as close as you can to those insects, and then pick something. If you can't find anything, try like the bottom two there, that you have a royal wolf and a red humpy. You can try something like that. That's just kind of an attractor. It looks buggy. It's highly visible to the fish because of the contrasting colors. Put on a San Juan worm. Put a couple of things together. There's a combination, they call it a worm and a turd, where it's a San Juan worm and the Pat's rubber legs. Have a dropper coming off of the Pat's rubber legs and put the worm on there. And that's just two different things that might catch their eye and take. Or you might put a hopper on there and hang a midge pupa below it. So that's just some ways to take what you found on the water or in the spider webs or whatever and try to match it to what's in your fly box. A really good resource, if you just can't remember everything I said, and maybe you don't believe some of the things, this is just what I do, is to go to a local fly shop. Sometimes they're the coolest places to go into anyway. Lots of tying materials, lots of gear, just about everything you can think of. You can buy flies in there, leaders, if you need some tippet material you're a little low on or you forgot to bring it. Tying materials, you can get snacks or whatever there. But talk to the guys and they'll tell you what species of fish are in the area. If you want to catch a brook trout, they'll tell you where to go to find brook trout. A lot of times, like I said, I'll just type into Google what kind of fish are in the Big Thompson River at um, at Estes Park, and it'll tell you that mostly brown, some rainbows, and there's a chance you could find some brook trout in there. But depending on the time of year, probably, and how fast the water flows are, all of that kind of stuff. This is a lot of stuff you can find out from the fly shop that this time of year, if you want brook trout, you need to go to these streams or go up higher in the mountains or whatever. They'll tell you what flies have been working because people come back in and say, hey, thanks for selling me that purple parachute Adams. They call it a purple haze. There's no purple mayflies, but for some reason they were killing it. And again, sometimes it's just something that's attractive to them. But they can tell you those types of things. Sometimes you don't really know the access points for streams. Some states have a lot more. Nebraska, it's a lot of private land. There's not a lot of public access for some of the trout streams that we have in this state. When you get into Montana, I think you have a lot less private land, and there's different rules and regulations. You can get a regulation book from the fly shop. They'll tell you reports from other anglers, what they've been seeing, what they've been using. And I think it's a key. I've heard it a lot, but it really makes sense if you're in there and you just ask them questions and then you just leave. They're probably not as likely to help you as if you go in there and maybe get some tippet material, get a couple flies, get some snacks or whatever. Just spend a little bit of stuff in their shop. Take some time to just really talk to them and get to know them, and they'll be a lot more likely to help you. Other than that, I just kind of wanted to cover, like I said, you don't really have to be a entomologist to know Calabatus, Isonychia, Drunella coloradensis, all the different species names. You don't have to identify them to that level. You can just say it's a dark mayfly, it's a light mayfly, and then try to find something that matches it as close as possible. I believe that to a trout, the most important thing when trout are going to be facing upstream, and because if they're facing downstream, they can't swim. They have to be facing upstream. So as they're sitting there in their little protected area, so they can hold without spending too much energy, they're going to be sitting there and they're looking up. And a lot of people say that they're probably in the most of the time trout are behind a rock, or they're in about the lower maybe 12 to 20 inches from the bottom, just because the current is slower at the bottom and they can hold there without expending too much energy. And they'll just look up and they'll wait for something to come floating by. And you'll see in videos, you can see trout grabbing sticks and leaves as they come by, but then they'll spit them out right away. If it looks like what they're expecting to be a food item, they'll actually go out of their lane to go get it because they know it's a food item. So I think profile is probably the biggest key. size. A lot of times, it's easier to imagine with dry flies. So if you have like a mayfly imitation floating down the current and the profile is right, but it's size 12 and the ones that they've been eating are a size 18, they might overlook it. If they're keying on size 12s and you put an 18 there, they may even not even see it because they're looking for the big juicy ones. So I think profile is probably the biggest key, and then size, and then color is, I think, third. But again, basic shade is sufficient, not necessarily that it's and they sell dubbing in all different colors, light olive, medium olive, golden olive, all these different colors of olive, where as long as it's, in that general range, I think that's more key. And again, light or dark. If you're fishing at night, it's always seemed counterintuitive to me, but a dark fly seems to show up better at night. A lot of times, if it's cloudy or sunny, they say uh, if it's dark, use a dark fly. If it's light, if it's bright, use a bright fly. But that's in general. If you can't really match any specific hatch or whatever, it's a lot better instead of just trying to figure it out and saying I just can't figure this out and spending too much time. Put some flies out there. Sometimes they'll be opportunistic, especially with terrestrials, ants, beetles, hoppers, um, an occasional cicada. There's all kinds of things out in the terrestrial world, moths, bees that might hit the water and go floating by, and they'll take advantage of those. And then all that you kind of researched and figured out, ahead of time. And then what you've observed by looking at the water and everything else. I guess ahead of time you have to know what you have for gear, but the keys are room to cast. Um, if you're going to be in the Black Hills and the streams there, you're probably going to want a shorter fly rod. You're not going to want a big 10-foot fly rod if you're under the trees and bushes and everything. And then, is it open or protected from the wind? Um, if it's likely to be pretty windy, you're probably going to want to lean up toward maybe a 5 or a 6 weight than a 3 or a 4 weight, because that lighter line isn't going to be able to have much control in windy conditions. And then kind of off subject a little bit, but it's pretty common, and the fly shops can probably help you a little bit with this too. But a lot of people will say if you fish in X stream, you need to make sure you're using a, 7X tippet or whatever. If your tippet selection needs to be mostly based on the size of the hook that you're using. So if you're using tiny dry flies, you can get by with a real fine tippet. For one thing, you can't get a heavy tippet through a size 20 or a 22 fly. But on the other hand, if you're using a size 6 stonefly nymph and you're using a real fine tippet, it doesn't matter what kind of knot you try to tie on there, it's probably going to break because it's around a real, thick wire hook. So if you get an opportunity to go to some trout water or whatever, just some kind of tips that I planned a few trips and didn't actually get to go. And then I planned some other ones and really had a good time. But I went up to Estes Park and hiked up to a lake, and I had the right kind of flies, and I knew what to expect and ended up catching some greenback cutthroats, and it was a really good time. So if you just do a little bit upfront preparation and then just research, just keep learning, you'll be prepared and have the stuff you need to hopefully catch some fish.